Greetings. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is David Mastery, and I've been studying astrology since 1984. And since I was a young boy, I've also been studying the readings of the renowned late 20th century American clairvoyant Edgar Cayce. My parents were both avid students of the readings given by Mr. Cayce and of the life of Mr. Cayce himself, and had been studying since the 1940s. They amassed a small library of material on the late Mr. Cayce, which I inherited upon their passing. In 2001, I became aware of the Swiss ephemeris provided by Astrology, which is available for use by the general public at astro.com on the internet. It is based on a program developed by Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL for short, and is remarkably accurate. Considering that NASA used the same program for space exploration, one couldn't find any similar such program to be more accurate, at least not to my knowledge. I wanted to use the Swiss ephemeris to produce a chart a month for a 20-year window of the time era 10 BC to 10 AD, to see if there were any possible configurations in the heavens that produced a 6-point symmetrical matrix, a grand sextile, as it is known to astrologers, that some people refer to as a Star of Solomon, and others refer to as a Mogan David, and still others as the Jewish Star. This is because my studies of astrology led me to find inferences that the Hebrews would only recognize one born as the Messiah as one having such a configuration on their birth chart. The writings of the late renowned astrologer DANE RUDHYAR, whom I have also studied the writings of a great deal, also infer that this is the belief of the Hebrews. I reckon that a chart produced for just one day out of every month over that 20-year window period would allow me to easily ascertain whether or not such an event happened during that period that Jesus of Nazareth certainly had to have been born during. In 1999, however, I became intimately associated with a woman that has remarkable healing talents. She was born with Pluto exactly conjunct her ascendant, and according to the authors Sabian and Acker of the book The Astrologer's Handbook, Pluto conjunct the ascendant produces, quote, "This conjunction in its highest aspect bestows the ability to see reality as energy. It gives a kind of X-ray vision that enables the natives to perceive the workings of the subtle forces of the universe unknown to other people. These intuitive abilities are at least equal to those produced by Uranus or Neptune conjunct the ascendant, but they are more consciously and deliberately used. The conjunction signifies willpower and stamina, which come from an ability to tap the subtle forces of nature for self-regeneration. The natives are usually aware of the need to redeem themselves by applying the will to spiritual development. At times they appear to be remote and unreachable because they are focusing their attention on a higher dimension of being. They tend to try to remake the circumstances in which they find themselves, and through the forces they can control, are able to exert a subtle and far-reaching influence upon their environments. They are aggressive, but not in the usual Mars sense, for they use secretive and even superphysical means of accomplishing their purposes. If Pluto is afflicted, this conjunction results in obstinacy and self-will. However, even then, the native's high level of consciousness produces a kind of spiritual detachment that helps prevent their being motivated by selfish personal gain. It is important for these natives that Saturn and Mercury be well placed and strongly aspected. They will thus be provided with the necessary discipline and the mental capacity to make constructive use of the powers available to them. The natives tend to have a very impersonal and universal attitude toward life and even toward themselves. However, these spiritual qualities will be manifested only in exceptional people whose overall level of development makes it possible for them to respond constructively to the high-frequency influence of this conjunction. The major factor in determining whether the powers bestowed by the conjunction will be used for unselfish, spiritual purposes or for selfish, destructive ones is this overall evolutionary development as revealed by the underlying tenor of the horoscope. Many natives simply will be unable to respond to the possibilities offered them by this conjunction. Those who have Pluto conjunct the ascendant must continually regenerate the image they project to the world, especially in relationship to the affairs ruled by the house which has Scorpio on its cusp." Unquote. Thus, before I used the little internet time available to me each day in 2001 to produce the 240 charts I would need to search for such a configuration as a grand sextile in the heavens during a 20-year span, and as I had to use a local library for the endeavor and was limited to 15 minutes per day, I thought that I would at least begin with the date Edgar Cayce gave for the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, and cast a chart for that day when Pluto was conjunct the ascendant. Bingo. I never had to search any further than that. In the following analysis, I utilized the Sabian symbols extensively. Their validity was proven to me when I first became interested in the subject of astrology, back in 1984. They, perhaps more than any other factor in astrology, are what got me interested in the study of astrology. They are symbolic representations of 360 divine precepts that, when followed in order, represent a cycle of transformation that is not limited to only astrology. They are known of to have been known and used by some ancient civilizations but had become lost over the ensuing centuries. In the mid-1920s, they were re-ascertained by astrologer Mark Edmund Jones with the assistance of a most qualified and excellent clairvoyant by the name of Elsie Wheeler. Dane RUDHYAR, whom had studied astrology under the tutelage of Mark Edmund Jones, and whom had previously studied the writings of Carl Jung, Nietzsche, the Vedas of ancient India, and numerous other schools of philosophy and psychology, received the blessing of Mark Edmund Jones to write a book interpreting and explaining the Sabian symbols, and got his permission to alter any that he thought might need to be so as to be more easily understood by the general public. As the images that came to the mind's eye of Elsie Wheeler were colored by her psyche, that of an early 20th century American woman, they certainly need both a bit of alteration and also a bit of modernization. Dane's background and previous studies, particularly symbology, along with his study of astrology, made him the most preeminently qualified individual at the time to interpret, explain, and even further refine the description of the symbols themselves, in my humble opinion. He spent nearly 40 years at the effort before he published his book on the Sabian symbols. The book is titled An Astrological Mandala, the Cycle of Transformation and its 360 Symbolic Phases. In Dane RUDHYAR's book, in the chapter titled The Cross and the Star, Dane goes on to explain the following. The cross, that is the axis formed by the horizon and the meridian of one's birth chart, create 4 points, and these 4 points he interprets as the what, the where to, the how, and the why of one's being. I would like to add here that as for where to, I sometimes reinterpret as either what to or whom to. RUDHYAR also wrote inferring that an axis of perfect symmetry, that is 90 degrees between all 4 axis points, that include the 4 points of the zodiac, Aries, Libra, Cancer, and Capricorn, all in the 1st degree, would have been involved in the birth chart of Jesus of Nazareth. These 4 degrees of the zodiac are associated with the following Sabian symbols as described by DANE in his book as thus. The first degree of Aries. A woman just risen from the sea. A seal is embracing her. His keynote phrase is emergence of new forms and the potentiality of consciousness. His key words are impulse to be. DANE inferred that Aries in the first degree would be the ascendant found on the birth chart of Jesus. So thus naturally, the inferred descendant is the first degree of Libra. DANE describes the first degree of Libra as thus. In a collection of perfect specimens of many biological forms, a butterfly displays the beauty of its wings, its body impaled by a fine dart. His keynote phrase is the immortal archetype reality that a perfect and dedicated life reveals. DANE wrote the following as part of the interpretation. Quote, the original notation of what the clairvoyant had seen indicated a butterfly made perfect by a dart through it, suggesting a process of perfection through sacrifice. Unquote. DANE concluded his interpretation of the first degree of Libra with the following words. Quote, this is the symbolical transfiguration at the Mount of Transfiguration. Jesus, the Son of Man, was impaled by the ray of the divine light, making him a Son of God. It was at this very moment that he learned of the crucifixion awaiting him. Thus, the merely human individual is, in RUDHYAR's key words, made sacred, becoming the pure embodiment of an archetype. Unquote. The other half of the birth chart, the line created by the nadir and the midhaven, the how and the why of the birth chart, was proposed by RUDHYAR to consist of the first degree of Capricorn and the first degree of Cancer. DANE, in his book, An Astrological Mandala, infers that the first degree of Cancer is the degree of the zodiac that is the nadir of the birth chart of Jesus. The description for the first degree of Cancer is as follows, according to DANE. Quote, on a ship, the sailors lower an old flag and raise a new one. His keynote phrase is a radical change of allegiance, exteriorized in a symbolic act, a point of no return. RUDHYAR's key word is reorientation. Unquote. RUDHYAR was thus proposing that the how of Jesus' life mission would be accomplished by becoming the new symbol of allegiance. With the first degree of Cancer as the nadir, then obviously the first degree of Capricorn is the midhaven. DANE gives the symbol as an Indian chief claims power from the assembled tribe. His keynote phrase, the power and responsibility implied in any claim for leadership. And DANE finished his summary on this symbol by writing, quote, it refers to the capacity latent in every individual to claim and assume authority in a vital group situation. His key word for this symbol is authority. Thus, RUDHYAR proposed, and even though he may have thought differently privately, that the axis of Jesus' birth chart would show his who to be just another life form emerging into this world. That is, Aries in the first degree. His where to, that is what he was to become, the perfect form of man, symbolized by the first degree of Libra. The true birth chart that has been produced, however, shows, as Edgar Cayce and many other spiritual teachers have taught, that Jesus was born the perfect form of man, and through his life by example, he demonstrated the path to the next step in spiritual, physical evolution, a higher, more spiritually evolved life form. That is to say, Libra 1 is the ascendant, and the first degree of Aries is the descendant. I also believe that when Pluto, the planet of transformation, is found exactly conjunct the ascendant, transformation, that is, the transition from who to whom to, is assured somehow, or at the very least, the catalyst is brought to bear on the individual in question. As for the other half of the axis, it's apparent that RUDHYAR proposed that how Jesus was to accomplish his mission, his dharma, was by becoming the new symbol or icon of allegiance, represented by the flag the sailors are raising symbolically. That is the first degree of Cancer. And as for the why of RUDHYAR's proposed chart for Jesus, it was to establish leadership over various groups of belief, or the various sects of Judaism, monotheism, and or remnant religions that had the sun prayers at their most ancient core. Whereas in the true birth chart I propose, that is that of Jesus of Nazareth, this cause and purpose is the same. Only the position of the 2 degrees at the nadir and the midhaven are switched. This is due to an understanding that came sometime after my book was published, that the first degree in the process of transformation is actually Virgo 30 degrees, and it culminates with Libra in the first degree. That is to say that the Theosophists and their esoteric astrology has it partially correct. The zodiac should be followed in the opposite direction from that as practiced by traditional astrologers, and thus the Sabian symbols represent a process of spiritual transformation when read in the clockwise direction around a chart that begins at 30th degree of Virgo. What the Theosophists fail to realize is that the process begins at Virgo 30 degrees and not Aries 1 degree. But then, in their defense, they never adopted the Sabian symbols as presented and interpreted by Dane RUDHYAR, or even those as given by Mark Edmund Jones, at least not to my knowledge. It has been traditionally accepted by astrologers that this evolutionary life process, represented by the 360 Sabian symbols, begins with the first degree of Aries, the emerging life form, and completes the cycle of 360 stages of transformation with the 30th degree of Pisces. The symbol for the 30th degree of Pisces is given by Mr. RUDHYAR as, quote, "A majestic rock formation resembling a face is idealized by a boy who takes it as his ideal of greatness, and as he grows up, begins to look like it." RUDHYAR's keynote phrase for this symbol is, quote, "The power of clearly visualized ideals to mold the life of the visualizer," unquote. RUDHYAR's summation on this symbol, quote, "This is the last stage of the last scene of the great ritual play of cyclic transformations. It brings to us a realization of the power of archetypes as factors conditioning life processes. Thus, we could use as a final key word, archetypalization." In RUDHYAR's book on the Sabian symbols, he inferred that the first degree of Aries will be found to be the ascendant on the birth chart of Jesus. Dane was thus stating that the who of the birth chart would be an emerging life form, and the where to, that is, the descendant, which is the first degree of Libra, would be the perfect form of man. Now, if one were to meditate on this process for a moment and picture an emerging biological life form, as represented by the Sabian symbol for the first degree of Aries, becoming through the cyclic process of completing the following 359 degrees of the zodiac, as symbolically represented by the 30th degree of Pisces, one understands that what is represented by this process is one of becoming more immersed in materiality, represented by the rock face and the symbol for the last degree of Pisces. That is, by the Vedic term, becoming more immersed in Maya. But what actually occurred, and the actual template of being that Jesus was given, is the opposite. His who is the first degree of Libra, and is the perfect form of man. And his where to is the first degree of Aries, the emerging life form. But in this sense, it is the next emerging life form, a higher life form, the next step in spiritual evolution. I believe that there is another process through the Sabian symbols that begins with the 30th degree of Virgo and culminates with the first degree of Libra. The 30th degree of Virgo is given symbolically by RUDHYAR as thus, quote, "Totally intent upon completing an immediate task, a man is deaf to any allurement." RUDHYAR's keynote phrase, quote, "the total concentration required for reaching any spiritual goal." RUDHYAR's summation is given as, quote, "This is the culminating step, the decision that results from a myriad of small choices. Still, a shadow of hesitation can remain. Attention may be distracted from the now by a voice from the past, glamorizing some old memory. The outer doors of perception and thought must be closed, so the soul can complete its." DANE's very significant keywords for this degree are conquest of illusion. Thus, there are two ways of proceeding through the Sabian symbols. One beginning with the first degree of Aries that ends with the last degree of Pisces and represents becoming more immersed in the material, more immersed in Maya. The other process begins with the last degree of Virgo, the 30th degree, and thus represents freeing oneself from the illusion, freeing oneself from materiality, freeing oneself from Maya, the illusion. As DANE RUDHYAR hinted in numerous books and articles, I quote, "The true path of discipleship begins in Virgo," unquote. It is the last degree of Virgo that is the first step, the beginning of the conquest of illusion. This chart I propose as being the correct birth chart for Jesus has the ascendant conjunct the first degree of Libra, and the moon is conjunct the last degree of Virgo. Jesus demonstrated that he was here as the perfect form of man, becoming the next higher evolved life form, and conquered the illusion of Maya. The part of fortune is often mistakenly interpreted by most astrologers as being about worldly goods. Nothing could be further from the truth. What it is about, it represents how one may achieve the most fortuitous circumstances as by which one can complete their dharma, complete their mission here on earth. The part of fortune derived from this chart is at 18 degrees 17 minutes Pisces. That is the 19th degree of Pisces. The symbol for which, by RUDHYAR's own words from his book, are: "A master instructs his disciple." Keynote: the transfer of power and knowledge which keeps the original spiritual and creative impulse of the cycle active and undeviated. The Hindu ideal of the sacred relationship between guru and chela, the disciple, has of late become familiar to a vast number of young and not so young people. The doctrine of the apostolic succession in the Roman Catholic Church has a similar significance. The power and archetypal knowledge released in the beginning of any cycle or at creation must be perpetuated until the very last day. The Omega state of which Teilhard de Chardin glowingly speaks. The power is the self of the cyclic manifestation, the unchanging tone, the Om of all existences within this cycle. It can be transmitted from master to disciple at the latter's initiation. It must be so transmitted, for when the line of transmission, in Sanskrit, the Guru Empara, is discontinued, the cyclic process begins to collapse in futility and spiritual darkness. This fourth-stage symbol gives us a clue to the supreme technique necessary for the continuation of all manifestations of power and spiritual understanding. The transmission is from person to person. It follows a general, unchanging pattern. Yet it operates in terms of particular and individual circumstances. Keyword, investiture. Unquote. Perfect. Wouldn't you say? The cusp of one's natal 12th house symbolically represents what your answer is to the greatest problem that world society faces as a whole. This natal chart has the 4th degree of Virgo at that cusp. From RUDHYAR's book, we get the Sabian symbol for the 4th degree of Virgo as thus, quote, "Black and white children play together happily. Keynote, the overcoming of socio-cultural prejudices. Freedom from all the forms, biases, and idiosyncrasies of the particular culture and class in which one has been born and educated is a sine qua non of the consciousness truly on the path. The ideal of universal brotherhood underlies all great spiritual teachings, for they are all like branches of the one tree, man in his divine state. This does not mean that there are no racial differences, but rather that these differences have a functional value in terms of the whole organism of man and of the planet Earth. At this 4th stage, the basic technique, which applies to all truly spiritual progress, is clearly stated. Every human being should be seen, approached, and warmly met as a child of God, or in less religious terms, as an exemplar of man. Such a status gives to every social and interpersonal group the character of a, RUDHYAR's key word here is brotherhood, unquote. This is just absolutely awesome, in my humble opinion. The part of catastrophe is an astrological part that will have its way. It is a catastrophe in a sense, but it is also a blessing, in that it will allow one to achieve one's destiny, to complete one's dharma. The part of catastrophe from this chart was derived to be at 27 degrees 3 minutes Virgo, that is to say the 28th degree of Virgo. From Dane's wonderful book, I quote, "Virgo 28 degrees, a bald-headed man who has seized power. Keynote, the sheer power of personality in times that call for decision. Whether at the religious or at the socio-political and cultural level, there comes a time when obsolescent patterns of order and cultural refinement have to be radically and relentlessly challenged. Catabolic personages emerge to seize power and dictate decisions that alter the structure of society or within an individual life. An intense urge for cathartic changes mobilizes the will, and traumatic decisions are made. At such times, the issue has to be met, and ruthless as the power may appear, it must be accepted. At this 3rd stage of the 36 sequence, we face the unpostponable necessity for decision and transformation. Existence is motion. No static formation, how beautiful and inspiring, can remain long unchallenged. Everything bows to, in RUDHYAR's key words, the power of the will, divine, executively human, or satanic, unquote. as DANE so brilliantly interpreted and wrote, the unpostponable necessity for decision and transformation, unquote. It seems that there wasn't much opportunity to mitigate much for Yeshua's sake, for Jesus' sake. He may have known just how much it was a necessity and unpostponable, and possibly Judas knew of this too. It has been said by some that Judas was the most knowledgeable of all the disciples, and that he understood why he had to betray Jesus to the authorities. Another astrological part that I'd like to mention here is the part of increase in benefits. This astrological part I have found to be the most closely associated with money or material wealth. For this chart, it was derived to be in the second degree of Gemini. RUDHYAR gives the symbol as thus: Santa Claus furtively filling stockings hanging in front of the fireplace. Keynote: a rewarded faith in spiritual blessings. I'm going to condense his description here just a bit and get to the heart of the matter. As DANE says, the reception of new blessings from the spiritual realm of above requires mostly faith and purity of heart, and a common type of understanding. Thus, a state of RUDHYAR's keyword here is innocence, unquote. Jesus was the penultimate good boy. It's what Santa Claus is all about. What could be more appropriate? When he was asked where they could find money for the fairy, he simply said, well, look under that rock. And there it was. Another part I'd like to mention, astrological part I'd like to mention from this chart, is the part of wisdom and intelligence. This has to do about how one most wisely applies their intelligence. From this chart, it was derived to be in the 19th degree of Scorpio. And from RUDHYAR's book, I quote, a parrot repeats the conversation he has overheard. Keynote: the capacity to transmit transcendental knowledge, unquote. Another astrological part I'd like to mention is the part of faith and belief. And from this chart, it was derived to be in the third degree of Taurus. From RUDHYAR's book, I quote, the third degree of Taurus. Natural steps lead to a lawn of clover and bloom. Keynote: the gradual expansion of the individual consciousness after a fecundating experience, unquote. Clover represents the Trinity. And from that, you can get an idea where Jesus' faith did lie. Another part I want to mention is the part of treachery and fraud. And from this chart, it was found to be in the 14th degree of Taurus. From RUDHYAR's book, I quote, on the beach, children play while shellfish grope at the edge of the water. Keynote: returning to simpler joys for revitalization. His keywords here are live and let live. Perfect, wouldn't you say? As you explore this chart, you will find that every astrological part has a precept that is perfectly described by the Sabian symbols as it was in relation to Jesus. The House Cusps have a Sabian symbol that perfectly embodies how the affairs of that house were conducted by Jesus. The Sabian symbols for the planet perfectly represent how the energies and influences of that planet were utilized by Jesus. You can try and find a copy of my book. It's rather hard at this time, but it is called A Template for the Time, the Astrological Birth Chart of Jesus. It is published by Hidden Mysteries, TGS Publishers, Frankston, Texas. Or you can go to the website astrologyweekly.com forum, and there in the subforum titled Other Astrology, under the further subforum titled Degree Symbols, you'll find a thread that is titled The Astrological Birth Chart of Jesus ? My moniker at that forum is Pierce the Veil. My path is onward and upward, following eternal light and love. I invite you to expand your knowledge, follow your heart, and prepare to enter new realms. May eternal light and love be yours. Thank you.